England, the 15th century, a kingdom torn apart by betrayal, ambition, and blood, a land where cousins became enemies, kings became prisoners, and thrones were won not by right, but by the sword. This was the War of the Roses, a brutal civil war between two great houses, Lancaster, bearing the red rose, and York, bearing the white. For over 30 years, they fought for the crown of England, leaving the kingdom drenched in blood and chaos. It was a story of noble families torn apart, of kings rising and falling in rapid succession, and a ruthless ambition that knew no mercy. These battles, betrayals, and shifting loyalties would one day inspire the epic saga of Game of Thrones. But the truth is darker than fiction. Behind every crown lay treachery, behind every victory lay slaughter, and behind every rose lay thorns. This is the real story of the Wars of the Roses, the kings, the battles, the betrayals, and the dynasty that emerged from the ashes to change history forever. In the late 14th century, England was ruled by Richard II, a king remembered not for wisdom, but for arrogance. Draped in wealth and surrounded by favorites, Richard alienated his lords. His court was filled with extravagance, while the kingdom beyond suffered. The nobles who had once supported him now whispered in anger, their patience stretched thin. Among them was Henry Bolingbroke, cousin to the king, who would soon rise to challenge his rule. What began as discontent would soon ignite into betrayal, a broken bar, and set England on a path toward civil war. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke seized his chance. With armed supporters at his back, he forced King Richard II from his throne. The Plantagenet crown passed into his hands, and he became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. But this was no peaceful transition. To the rival House of York, Henry was not a rightful king, but a usurper. The throne had been stolen, and the wound would never heal. Though the red rose of Lancaster now crowned England, the white rose of York waited patiently in the shadows. Henry IV's reign was troubled, but his son, Henry V, restored Lancaster pride. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, he led England to a stunning victory against overwhelming French forces. He was the warrior king England needed, a bold, charismatic, and victorious. Yet his triumphs were short-lived. Henry V died young, leaving behind an infant son, Henry V. With a child on the throne, England's strength began to unravel. A kingdom forged in battle now faced weakness at its very heart. Henry V was no warrior like his father. Gentle, pious, and frail, he lacked the will to rule. Worse still, he suffered bouts of madness, leaving England leaderless. In his weakness, one figure stepped into power, his queen, Margaret of Anjou. Fierce and determined, she vowed to protect her husband's throne and her son's inheritance at any cost. But her strength was met with an equally ambitious rival, Richard, Duke of York, who believed his claim to the crown was stronger than Henry's. The realm was now divided between a timid king, a fierce queen, and a ruthless duke. Across England, whispers began to spread. The nobles and common folk alike spoke of two roses, the red of Lancaster, and the white of York. Families chose sides, loyalties divided, and the kingdom stood on the brink of war. The rivalry was no longer hidden, it was destiny. With a weak king, an ambitious duke, and a queen who would not yield, the stage was set for the bloodiest family feud in English history. The War of the Roses was about to begin. The year was 1455, and England's crown sat upon a man unfit to rule. King Henry VI, plagued by weakness and bouts of madness, had fallen into a state of near catatonia. For months, he could not govern, could not speak, and sometimes could not even recognize those around him. In his absence, Richard, Duke of York, seized the role of protector of the realm. For a time, York ruled England in the king's stead, and his influence grew stronger than ever. But when Henry recovered, even slightly, everything changed. Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce, proud, and unwilling to see York rise, moved quickly to restore Lancaster power. Richard was pushed aside, his allies dismissed. To Margaret, the Duke of York was no loyal servant of the crown, he was a rival, a usurper in waiting, and a deadly threat to her young son's inheritance. The tension could no longer be contained. England was about to see blood spilled, not in defense of the realm, but in a struggle between two roses. And the first blow was about to fall. On May 22, 1455, the rival armies of Lancaster and York met outside the market town of Street, Albans, just north of London. This was no grand campaign with tens of thousands of men. Barely a few thousand soldiers stood on either side, but its importance could not be overstated, for it was the beginning of open war. The Yorkists struck swiftly, using surprise and determination. They broke through the Lancastrian defenses. Arrows filled the sky, swords clashed in the narrow streets, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the town. For the first time in generations, Englishmen were killing Englishmen, not for king and country, but for rival claims to the throne. The fighting was brutal and confused. Houses and gardens became battlegrounds, and the cobbled streets ran with blood. Though small in scale, the Battle of Street, Albans would mark the beginning of 3 decades of war that would engulf the kingdom. Among the dead that day lay some of the most powerful men in England. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, long despised by the House of York, was cut down in the fighting. Alongside him fell Northumberland and Clifford, pillars of the Lancastrian cause. The defeat was devastating, for it robbed Margaret and Henry of their strongest defenders. More than just a battle, Street, Albans was an execution ground for Lancaster's leadership. The Yorkists had struck at the very heart of their enemies, leaving Henry exposed and humiliated. Captured in the aftermath, the king was once again forced into the custody of the Duke of York, but Richard of York did not seize the crown, and not yet. Instead, he placed Henry back on his throne, hoping to control the realm through him. It was a gamble that would not bring peace, but only delay the inevitable bloodshed to come. Though Henry was once again a prisoner of circumstance, Margaret of Anjou remained defiant. For every noble slain at Street, Albans, she vowed revenge. Her pride and fury became the driving force of the Lancastrian cause. She saw clearly what others only whispered. Richard of York was not satisfied with influence. He wanted the crown itself. Margaret swore to protect her son's birthright at any cost. Across England, she rallied support, calling on loyal lords to rise against York. For her, this was not merely a quarrel of politics. It was survival, for herself, for her son, and for the future of Lancaster. The victory of York at Street, Albans was not the end, it was the beginning. Margaret's wrath would fuel the flames of war, ensuring that blood would be repaid with blood. And so, with swords drawn and banners raised, England stood divided. The red rose of Lancaster, proud and unyielding, against the white rose of York, ambitious and determined. This was no longer a private rivalry, it was a struggle that would engulf the realm, drawing in every family, every noble house, every soldier from castle to village. The Battle of Street, Albans was only the spark. Soon, far greater battles would rage across the kingdom. Tens of thousands would march, thousands would die, and the crown of England would pass from head to head in a deadly game of survival. The War of the Roses had begun, and England would never be the same again. England, once united under the Plantagenet kings, now burned with division. The War of the Roses had spread far beyond noble halls and royal courts as flames consumed the land itself. Villages were plundered, farms destroyed, and the ordinary people of England suffered most. To them, the war was not about roses or crowns, it was about survival. Everywhere, soldiers marched under banners of red or white. To refuse service was to risk death, and to serve meant to kill neighbors who once shared bread and ale. Entire towns were forced to choose sides, often at sword's edge. This was not only a war of kings, but a civil war tearing England's heart apart. The people whispered of omens of storms, of failed harvests, of God's anger upon a kingdom soaked in blood. Yet the lords, blinded by ambition, pressed onward, and the land grew darker with every passing year. In 1460, Richard of York made his boldest move yet. Standing in Parliament, he placed his hand upon the throne and declared his claim to the crown. For him, the line of Lancaster was illegitimate. Henry was weak, his rule disastrous, and the realm demanded stronger leadership. The moment stunned England. Never before had a subject dared so openly to challenge an anointed king. The hall erupted in chaos. Shouts of fury from Lancaster loyalists clashed with cheers from Yorkist allies. Henry, pale and broken, offered no resistance. He could not even summon the strength to defend his crown. In the end, a compromise was forged. Henry would keep the throne for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son, Edward of Westminster, but to Richard of York and his heirs, to Queen Margaret. This was nothing less than theft of her child's destiny. The seeds of her vengeance were sown that very day. Queen Margaret would not wait for her husband's death to decide the future. She gathered her forces, uniting loyal Lancastrian lords to strike back. At Wakefield, in the winter of 1460, her army fell upon Richard of York with ferocity. The battle was merciless. Richard fought bravely, but he was outnumbered, surrounded, and betrayed by those he thought allies. His forces crumbled, and he himself was cut down on the field. His body was desecrated, his head displayed upon the gates of York, mocked with a paper crown. The death of Richard was a devastating blow to the House of York, but it did not end their cause. Instead, it lit a fire of vengeance, for though Richard had fallen, his son Edward would rise to take his place, and the war, far from ending, was about to escalate into greater fury than ever before. Margaret of Anjou emerged from Wakefield not as a queen consort, but as the true leader of the Lancastrian cause. Where her husband faltered, she commanded with steel. Clad in armor, she became a warrior queen, feared and admired in equal measure. For Margaret, every battle was personal. Her husband was weak, her son's inheritance under threat, and the Yorkists had dared to challenge the bloodline of Lancaster itself. She inspired loyalty not with softness, but with fury. Men followed her into battle not just for gold or honor, but out of fear and devotion to her cause. Yet Margaret's ruthlessness also earned her enemies. Tales spread of her vengeance, of villages ravaged and prisoners slaughtered. To her supporters, she was a lioness defending her cub. To her foes, she was a Frenchwoman with a heart of iron, willing to plunge England into endless bloodshed. By 1461, the kingdom was in flames. Lancaster and York no longer sought compromise, the only victory. The battles were larger, the casualties greater, and the hatred deeper. It was no longer a matter of lords and nobles, but of a nation divided against itself. The throne of England had become a prize drenched in blood, passed not through law or lineage, but through battle and betrayal. Each side claimed divine right, yet both drowned the land in suffering. From the ashes of Wakefield and the fury of Margaret rose a new challenger, Edward of York, tall, charismatic, and determined to avenge his father. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest confrontations in English history, a battle that would decide not only the crown, but the very soul of the realm. In the wake of Richard of York's death, his eldest son, Edward, rose to claim leadership of the House of York. Barely 19 years old, Edward was everything his father was: noted tall, charismatic, and a natural warrior. Where Richard inspired loyalty with lineage, Edward inspired it with charm and strength. His men called him a king even before he wore a crown. Edward understood that the war was no longer about rival dukes, but about the throne itself. He rallied his forces with speeches that stirred their hearts. He promised not only vengeance for his father's death but also a new dawn for England, an end to weak kingship, and a reign built on victory. To his followers, Edward seemed destined for greatness. The White Rose had found its champion, and the kingdom would soon feel the power of his ambition. March 1461 brought the most savage battle ever fought on English soil, the Battle of Towton. Snow and wind lashed the field as over 60,000 men clashed beneath the banners of red and white. The storm favored Edward. With the wind at their backs, Yorkist archers unleashed volleys that tore into the Lancastrian lines. As the armies collided, swords rang and spears shattered, the snow turning crimson with the blood of thousands. For hours the slaughter raged, with neither side willing to yield. At last, Edward's forces pushed their foes into retreat. The fleeing Lancastrians were cut down in rivers and fields, their bodies piling so thick that bridges collapsed under the weight of corpses. By day's end, perhaps 20,000 men lay dead. It was not just a battle, it was a massacre, and it gave Edward what he sought, a crown bought in blood. On the heels of Towton, Edward entered London in triumph. The people, weary of Henry's weakness, welcomed him as their savior. In Westminster Abbey, he was crowned Edward IV, the first true Yorkist king. His coronation marked more than a change of dynasty, it was a rebirth of kingship itself. Edward was young, bold, and filled with vitality, a stark contrast to Henry's pale fragility. He surrounded himself with loyal companions, men who had fought beside him, and promised to rule with strength and justice. Yet even as Edward basked in his victory, danger lingered. Margaret of Anjou was not defeated. She fled with Henry and her son, gathering support in Scotland and France. The Red Rose still lived, and Edward knew his crown was not yet secure. For all his skill in battle, Edward's greatest gamble came not on the field, but in love. In 1464, he secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner whose beauty captivated him. The marriage stunned England. Kings did not marry for love, they married for power, for alliances, for the strength of dynasties. Edward's choice enraged his chief ally, Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick known as the Kingmaker. Warwick had been negotiating a marriage alliance with France, one that would have secured Edward's throne. But with one impulsive act, Edward had shattered those plans. Though Elizabeth would become queen, her presence at court divided nobles, bred resentment, and ignited a bitter feud between Edward and Warwick. What began as a love story would soon sow the seeds of betrayal. Warwick, once Edward's greatest supporter, now turned against him. Proud and ambitious, he believed he had made Edward king and he would not be cast aside. His anger drove him to the unthinkable alliance with Margaret of Anjou, the very woman he once fought to destroy. Together, they plotted Edward's downfall. Warwick promised to restore Henry VI, the feeble king he once despised, while Margaret saw at last her chance to reclaim her son's inheritance. It was a union born not of friendship, but of necessity and vengeance. For Edward IV, the crown he had won in battle was now threatened by betrayal within his own camp. The sun and splendor had risen high, but dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the kingdom once more teetered on the edge of chaos. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, had earned his title as the Kingmaker. It was through his cunning, his wealth, and his armies that Edward IV had seized the throne. Yet Warwick's pride could not be contained. He believed that as he had made a king, so too could he unmake one. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had insulted him, stripping away his plans and diminishing his influence at court. Worse still, the Woodville family rose swiftly in power, taking lands, titles, and privileges that Warwick had expected for his own allies. To Warwick, this was betrayal, but Warwick was no man to sulk in silence. His ambition turned to anger, his loyalty to hatred. Soon, he began to whisper with Edward's enemies, plotting in shadows, waiting for the moment when the sun and splendor would fall. In a twist that stunned England, Warwick sought out his former foe, Margaret of Anjou. Once bitter enemies on the battlefield, they now found common cause, the destruction of Edward IV. Margaret, still burning with vengeance for the loss of her husband's crown, welcomed Warwick's hand. Their pact was uneasy, two powerful figures bound not by trust, but by necessity. Warwick promised to restore Henry VI, the feeble king Margaret adored, while Margaret pledged her support against Edward. Their alliance was sealed through marriage. Warwick's daughter wed Margaret's son, Prince Edward of Westminster. This union sent shockwaves through England. The Kingmaker, who had once crushed Lancaster, was now their champion. It was proof that in the War of the Roses, loyalty was fleeting, and ambition ruled above all. Warwick struck quickly. In 1469, he raised rebellion in the north, drawing thousands to his banner. The king, caught off guard, found himself abandoned by allies and betrayed by those he trusted. In the chaos, Edward was captured, stripped of his power, and held in Warwick's custody. For a moment, it seemed as if the Kingmaker had won. Edward's crown lay within his grasp. Yet Warwick soon learned that ruling through Henry VI was no simple task. The once deposed king, restored to his throne, was but a shell of a monarch, gentle, pious, and incapable of governance. Disorder spread, lawlessness thrived, and Warwick's control began to slip. The people saw not strength, but weakness. And as unrest grew, Edward found his chance to escape. The sun and splendor rose once more, ready to reclaim the crown that Warwick had stolen. In April 1471, the rivalry reached its bloody climax at the Battle of Barnet. Dawn broke upon a thick fog, cloaking the battlefield in confusion. Warwick's forces clashed with Edward's loyalists, neither side able to see friend from foe. In the chaos, Disaster struck the Lancastrian cause. Warwick's own men mistakenly attacked their allies, mistaking their banners in the mist. Panic spread like wildfire, and Edward seized the moment. With a thunderous charge, he broke through Warwick's lines. The kingmaker fought valiantly, refusing to flee. But his defiance ended in death, cut down by the very war he had once mastered. His body lay cold in the mud, stripped of power and pride. The man who had made and unmade kings was himself unmade, his ambition drowned in blood. News of Warwick's death spread swiftly. His body was displayed in London, proof to all that the kingmaker's reign had ended. Some mourned him as a fallen giant, others whispered curses at his betrayal, but none could deny his place in history. Warwick had risen higher than any noble in his time, holding the fate of kings in his grasp, yet his downfall was as swift as his rise. In choosing ambition over loyalty, he had bound himself to shifting alliances that offered only ruin. With Warwick gone, Edward IV's throne seemed secure. The Lancastrian cause lay in shambles, its hopes dimmed. But Margaret of Anjou and her son still lived, and the Red Rose was not yet finished. The war, though bloodied, was far from over. With Warwick dead and Henry VI once more a prisoner, Edward IV reclaimed his throne. For a time, the realm seemed at peace, yet behind the splendor of Edward's court, new ambitions were quietly stirring. At the king's side stood his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was loyal, fierce, and deadly in battle, but he was also deeply ambitious. Unlike his elder brother George, who had wavered between sides, Richard never faltered in service to Edward. This loyalty earned him power and land, and he quickly became one of the most feared lords in England. But Richard's sharp mind and ruthless heart held desires beyond mere titles. He watched carefully, learning how kingship was won and lost, and in the shadows of his brother's reign, he waited for his chance to rise. In May 1471, Edward secured his throne by ending the life of his rival once and for all. Henry VI, the gentle, broken king, was murdered in the Tower of London. Though no witness dared speak openly, many believed the deed was done at Richard's hand or at least by his command. The death of Henry marked the true end of the Lancastrian line. Margaret of Anjou was captured, her son slain in battle, and the Red Rose seemed to wither. Yet the shadow of Richard's ambition only grew longer. For every obstacle removed, his path to power became clearer. The Plantagenet crown, once divided between red and white, was now firmly Yorkist. But within the House of York itself, rivalries still festered. Edward was strong, but his death would open the door to ambition, and Richard was waiting. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, at the age of just 40. His death shocked the realm. Though his reign had brought relative stability, his passing left a dangerous void. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old, too young to rule, too vulnerable to command. Queen Elizabeth Woodville sought to protect her son, gathering her family around him. But Richard of Gloucester moved swiftly. As protector of the realm, he escorted the boy king to London ostensibly for his safety. Yet whispers spread quickly that Richard's intentions were darker. The streets of London filled with mourning, but also with fear. For many sensed that Edward IV's death was not the end of Yorkist rule, but the beginning of betrayal within its very heart. The boy king Edward V and his younger brother, also named Richard, were lodged in the Tower of London supposedly for protection before the coronation. But as days turned to weeks, the truth became clear. They were prisoners, not guests. One by one, the Woodvilles and other Yorkist loyalists were stripped of power. Richard of Gloucester declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, making their children illegitimate. With a stroke of law, the princes were removed from succession. Then, one summer night, the whispers began. The boys had vanished. No one saw them again. Their fate remains one of history's darkest mysteries, whether murdered on Richard's orders or silenced by others who sought power. But the world believed they were dead, and Richard seized the crown. He was proclaimed King Richard III, a ruler whose reign would forever be shadowed by the blood of children. Richard III's reign was brief, marked by distrust and rebellion. His ruthless path to power had won him a crown, but cost him the loyalty of his people. Many turned to a new hope. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian exile with a distant claim to the throne. In 1485, Their forces met at Bosworth Field. Richard fought like a man possessed, leading charges himself, determined to end Henry before he could seize the crown. His courage was undeniable, but fate was against him. Betrayed by his allies, Richard found himself surrounded. Refusing to flee, he fought to the last breath, cut down in the mud and blood of battle. His crown, knocked from his head, was placed upon Henry Tudor's brow. The last Plantagenet king lay dead, his body stripped and paraded, his dynasty ended. The War of the Roses had reached its bloody conclusion. Bosworth Field was more than just the death of Richard, i.e. it was the birth of a new dynasty. As the battle ended, Richard's crown was found in the mud and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor by Lord Stanley. In that moment, a Welsh exile, with only a tenuous claim to the throne, became Henry VII, King of England. His rise was nothing short of extraordinary. For years, Henry had lived in exile, a fugitive hunted across France and Brittany, his life hanging by a thread. Few believed he would ever return, let alone triumph. Yet destiny had carried him from the shadows to the crown. But Henry knew his victory was fragile. To truly secure the throne, he needed more than the loyalty of soldiers. He needed to heal a kingdom torn apart by decades of civil war, and he had a plan, one that would forever change England. To end the feud that had torn England apart, Henry VII turned to marriage. In 1486, he wed Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and sister to the lost princes in the Tower. Their union was not just a marriage of love, but of politics, a blending of red and white. From this union came a new emblem, the Tudor Rose, red for Lancaster, white for York, fused together as one. The symbol declared to England that the war was over, that division would give way to unity. The wedding was celebrated with joy across the realm. For the first time in years, the people dared to hope for peace. The bloody struggle between roses had ended not by sword, but by union. And with that, a new dynasty took root. Henry VII was not a warrior king like Edward IV, nor a pious dreamer like Henry V. He was something different, cold, cautious, and calculating. He ruled with prudence, understanding that the strength of a crown lay not just in armies, but in wealth and control. He restored order to a kingdom long scarred by lawlessness. He curbed the power of the nobility, filling his treasury while stripping rebellious lords of theirs. Through taxes, trade, and diplomacy, Henry built a monarchy stronger than any before him. Yet beneath his careful rule lay constant paranoia. Pretenders and claimants haunted his reign, some claiming to be lost Yorkisters. Each rebellion reminded Henry that though the roses had been joined, their thorns were not forgotten. Still, through cunning and discipline, he held his throne and prepared the way for the Tudors to flourish. The Tudor rose became more than a symbol, it became a promise that England would no longer be divided by dynastic hatred. Red and white, Lancaster and York, were bound together under a single crown. But this peace was built upon the bones of countless thousands. The ghosts of Henry V, Edward IV, and Richard III still lingered, reminders of how fragile power could be. The Wars of the Roses had destroyed dynasties, toppled kings, and left scars upon the land. Henry VII's task was to bury those ghosts and build something lasting. And though whispers of rebellion continued, his dynasty endured. In the Tudor Rose, England found unity, not perfect, not free from struggle, but a path forward after years of chaos. And so, after 3 decades of civil war, England stood reborn. The War of the Roses had ended not with the destruction of one house, but with the union of both. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had given the nation a new beginning, one that would shape centuries to come. From their union would come Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and a dynasty that transformed England into a world power. The Tudors would carry the kingdom from medieval struggle into the dawn of empire. The roses, once drenched in blood, had been woven into a single crown, and though the memories of war lingered, a new chapter of history had begun at the age of the Tudors, born from the ashes of civil war. And so, after 3 decades of bloodshed, the Wars of the Roses came to an end. The crown passed from York to Lancaster, and finally into the hands of the Tudors, who bound the red and white roses into one. From the chaos of civil war, Henry VII forged a dynasty that would reshape England. His son, Henry VIII, and granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would lead the kingdom into an age of power, discovery, and empire. The Tudor rose became not just a symbol of peace, but of a nation reborn. Yet the story of the Wars of the Roses lives on not only in the chronicles of history, but in the legends and tales that followed. For in these kings and queens, in their betrayals and triumphs, we see the seeds of every throne claimed and every crown lost. This was England's true Game of Thrones, as a story not of fiction, but of history. A story of roses, of blood, and of the crown that cost so much to wear.